as an American people, we don't like regulations, right? We don't like being told what to do. Try to get 10 people in the same department within one company to agree on anything is nearly impossible, right? So how can we chase this industry-wide standard on how we're going to classify information and share information? It's a really big pill to swallow, if you will. Well, I think this discussion went a long way in trying to break that down and having different folks involved in that conversation and perspectives. Um, the key thing to take away from all of this is the need to prepare early in the process to understand what information there is to manage. And the timing of when people come in to put in their 2 cents is less important than everybody having the understanding of what information we're trying to manage. One of the points that Nigel brought up is that the B in BIM kind of throws people off because we have vertical, we have horizontal, and all the opinions start hitting there. It really comes down to information management. So let's go slow to go fast. Take the time to set up consensus on those things that we can by that particular project. We don't have to agree as an industry across all projects. We just need a framework of how we can make those classifications within an individual project. And then have some normalization so that everybody's saying the same thing. The key thing, and I think that's when everybody was shaking their head up and down, as Nigel described it, it's 19650 is a framework for how information is delivered, not a specification or a requirement for what is delivered, right? It gives folks an ability to have that conversation and come to agreement on what they need to, and please just standardize on a particular project, and then your project will go well. If you don't do it, it will have problems. And I think everybody who's on this call right now can count probably 10 different times where it just didn't go well. Let's try to work towards that framework, that consensus. Rachel kind of wrapped up the conversation with, I think, a very important point that technology has made the state of the possible, right? And now everybody else is catching up. So you have your individuals, your businesses, and public policy that are all much flatter curves than the steep technology curve. Okay, great. So we can do this, but it's going to take people, the businesses that they work for, and then the public policy that's driving all this time to catch up. So let's go look at peeling the onion in a different way. 19650 gives us that ability in that we can work towards the consensus and then continuously put out annexes to help drive the clarity in those specific municipalities or countries or organizations, vertical versus horizontal. Let's learn from what they did in the UK. Let's not try to chart our own course here. We're here today to talk about the design handoff as part of the digital twin, continuing digital twin conversation. It's really going to be focusing more around our ability to introduce standards into the process of what we do. They're pretty prevalent in other parts of the world, but as typical Americans, we like to push back and say we don't need that because everybody wants to do it their way. So we're going to hear about some real activities, some real actions, and this grew out of the conversation in the last breakout where we had some great questions from folks that some of which are here today that allowed us to get to this point, so we can really start to dig into things. So we have a typical way we kick this off. How might we in ways because we want to ask questions that get us to an end result. So how might we leverage international standards, the ISO 19650, to increase the digital quality of the design deliverable handoff in ways that improve process efficiency and reduce errors between senders and recipients of the information so that future conflicts between local, state, or federal reporting mandates can be avoided? the key here is to have a why, right? If there's no why that folks can agree on, then it's going to be really hard to get folks to agree on a way to conform with or comply with any particular uh, standards that we do put into place. So we have Nigel and Rachel with us today to offer some firsthand experience on ways that folks are doing things in the UK. Understand the difficulties in the why, the improvements in the why, and the outcomes that they've seen around that. And then Rachel will also be looking at it from a U.S. perspective and some of the work that she's doing. So let's just frame the discussion today so we understand the scope of what we're talking about. We're really at this point in the conversation talking about passing things between design and build. We've gone through some design iteration. We're ready to take this into the world where the ideation then becomes reality. And then within this particular scope, really what we're trying to do is to say, okay, we have a design over here that allows us to flow through, and what kind of stuff needs to be in place so that we can have this machine processing, this transfer of information between systems, and folks are on the same page. So there are some things that are going to be machine readable that can trigger actions on the other side. Some of this is meant to classify the document itself, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes when we get around the naming convention. So let's see, is Rachel back yet? Looks like. Okay, so if Nigel and Rachel, if you'll just take a minute to introduce yourselves before we get into the heart of the conversation.
Oh, I'm back, and I think Nigel's going to take the wheel after this. I'll introduce myself first. Rachel Riopel with HDR, and I'm the current chair of the National BIM program with the National Institute of Building Sciences. I think I'm here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and hear your thoughts, because we are looking at the National BIM Standards version 4, shaping up here with some additional resources being built in to address core BIM requirements. But that team is really doing a great job of actually looking at all the standards in the industry globally. The ISO 19650 is no small piece of that as well. So we're working hard on building that version 4, and we actually were in a meeting yesterday. That team is very hard at work analyzing that with some good research partners at the University of Washington. So glad to share that insight here as we continue the conversation. Nigel?
Yeah, so I'm Nigel Davis. I work for a company based out of the UK called Evolve Consultancy. In terms of the ISO 19650 story, we've been involved for a long time in it now. I'm sure you're all aware of the efforts being put in by the UK to standardise everything, which hence why I'm here today. I've been involved with this for a number of years, since prior to ISO 19650, when it was the 1192 series here in the UK, PAS 1192. And I've been both on steering committees for the contents going into the standards, and also on review committees. In fact, I was one of the chairs of the focus group that looked at the guidance that the UK BIM Alliance has just produced on this documentation. So I've been involved in it from a business side of perspective, delivering it to our customers, and also from a wider perspective, looking at people's understandings, preconceptions, and difficulties in implementing the requirements of the 19650 workflows that are in there. So any perspectives I can give today, and I'm going to be realistic. I'm not going to say everything's great and we've been doing it for 15 years and isn't the UK wonderful. It's not. It's simply not as easy as that. But I do want to give some kind of, if particularly in conjunction with things like the BIM standards over there, how it fits and the problems we've had. If I can help with that, that's what I'm here to do today.
Very good. Appreciate the perspective from both of you and the introductions. Before I flip to the next slide, there's a handful of slides here that our contributors are going to talk through and give opinions on and thoughts. If anybody has questions along the way, wave your hand on Zoom. I'll keep my eye open.
We already got one from Nick in the chat.
Okay, I'll pull up the chat and have that on the side too. So once we get into the process, I'll try to monitor that best we can. If you don't see me getting it, get my attention, because we do want this to be an interactive conversation. It's not meant to be a pure teaching session. I think there's learning all the way around when we get into a more conversational approach. So.
Sure. So when we were talking about this session, we kind of thought it'd just be useful to give a bit more background. I see there's a comment there from Nick that says, curious to learn about 1192 and its evolution to 19650. Well, I mean, this is the timeline from a European / UK perspective of where we've got to where we are today. And without going through this, with a fine-tooth comb, we've got better things to discuss and talk about than going through this. You can see it has been a long journey to get to where we are today. With the right on the left-hand side there, the first use of the term BIM back in 1992. Please don't ask to remember what paper that was in, but I've got it written down somewhere. It was a Dutch document, in fact, where the term was first written down. It may have been used before that. All the way through the development of things like the Uniclass classification system that we use over here. All the way through to when it really started to take a really big change, and that was from our perspective, and where 1192 came from and how it's moved on to ISO 19650, was the UK government sitting down in 2011 and basically saying, we've got to sort this out. We've talked about it many times, how are we actually going to change the efficiency of how we deliver construction in the UK? And that ended up setting the mandate that presumably you're all aware of, that by 2016, all publicly procured projects would be delivered using the principles of information management / BIM. 1192 did what it needed to do, but it was limited in its scope. It was much more talking about BIM and VDC than it was about the general information management needs on a project, and we found that limited it. It migrated onto 19650 because the world looked at it and said, okay, look, this is great. It doesn't really apply to us. What we need to do is to come up with some more, I will say, generic kind of approaches and standardization that can apply to anybody in any situation, because everybody's industries are slightly different. The way things are done contractually, deliverable wise, it's all slightly differently. So that's where 19650 came from. And it learned on the lesson, there was a lot wrong with the 1192 series, a lot. I'm not saying that ISO 19650 is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but what it did, it looked at it and said, well, how can we resolve that? How can we do that? What it did was threw away this whole kind of concept that it's BIM. And that's one of the things in the UK that we're finding now, is the term BIM itself is putting a lot of people off and saying, well, that's the technical, that's the nerd side of things. What it's become more than that is about the management of information and delivery, as this session is about on a project. So if we go on to the next slide, Kelly, what I've done is put a kind of just a real overview. I don't want to take, again, too long on this on the next slide. There we go. This goes through the various sections that ISO 19650 covers. And whenever we're starting to talk with this about anybody, the first thing that they need to understand is information management is a requirement for everybody on the project. It's not just one small portion of the delivery side of things. The client has responsibilities. And 19650 is split down into the sections that they need to do to prepare the invitations to tender. They then start, I'm not going to go through all the terminology today, try and stay away from that when we're talking to anybody about it, but you then got the requirements of the delivery team. That's broken down into the person who's in charge and whether there's subcontracted works going on there, which is typical in the UK, and I'm sure is the same with general contractors over in the US. The tasks that they need to do to be able to deliver the information. And actually, if you just jump onto the next slide, the one bit that we try to get across straight away is when people used to think about BIM, and BIM coordination, as we talk about it here in the UK, that's the section that we're talking about. Just one small part, the delivery of the the generation of the models, generation of the documentation, and the coordination that goes backwards and forwards with clash detection, all those kind of things. That's the one small section of the project. And while it's a, it's a very important section of the project, there is so much more to it than that ISO 19650 tries to standardize. And a lot of it is in the preparation and the readiness for that actual delivery there, which is, your CD stage or your SD stage, and through to construction there. If you haven't made that preparation, if you haven't got this in place, that one area of delivery is so much more troublesome. And that's what we're finding now is people are, just to leave it here, and I think there might be one more slide, but that's what we're finding now. The stage we're at is we've done it, we've been talking about it, we know what this is. We are now seeing a huge interest and uptake in this because it's moved away from the technical side of things into the more important general information management and how we get a project delivered rather than whether it's done in Revit or whether it's done in 3D or whether, that's what it's about from our perspective. And hopefully that'll kind of lead into where we are in the UK, and we can go into a bit more detail in the conversation.
Yeah, one question before we leave this slide. Anybody that's been on one of these roundtables with me before, I have an old adage: you have to go slow to go fast, and that's what I'm seeing here on this screen. Without occupying the entire time, because I'm sure you could fill it. Are there any particular a particular story, a manifestation of what you're talking about, where they didn't go slow? They just went right into going fast, and the information management just fell apart. And what was the outcome?
There's plenty of examples of that. I think it's probably better to look at it from the different. Most of the jobs that we work with are a last-minute attempt to fit everything in at delivery, and that's when it falls apart, when people haven't prepared for it, particularly the design teams. They've said, oh, look at all these requirements from the client, they're not required. They get to deliver the PDFs, the specifications, the whatever at the end of the project, and the client turned around and said, well, you haven't given me the information to go into our CAFM system. You haven't given us the asset information that we actually need to manage the project. And then everybody's trying to shoehorn it in. Honestly, a lot of our work at the moment is to deal at that point where things have gotten too late, and how does the delivery team actually get on and put that information back into the data back into their deliverables, or from the client perspective is looking at it and going, actually revisiting this, what could we have done better? And it always comes back to understanding the information required to manage the asset after its construction. And so absolutely typical case, as you say there, Kelly, of going slow to go fast. If you don't know what you need to manage it, you're never going to be able to get the deliverables you need to do that.
Well, and Nigel, on that point, I guess how much of it does have to do with general contractor or even, down to trade contractor level input earlier on, or that's always a two-edged sword, right? Because you can get them involved too early, but certainly I think Kelly and others, Kelly Lubley would attest that all this stuff is too late in the US. Have you played around with when is the right time to bring in the trade and GC perspectives?
Do you know what? I think the answer to that is not so much when they're brought in. They can work at whatever point they're brought in, provided it's been prepared for, and provided they are working under the assumption that what is being asked for is actually needed. There's a big disconnect in the UK between the technical delivery and the managerial delivery, in the fact that people know what they want to get delivered and the technical side that they need to get this information across to handover, but it hasn't been priced for. Corners have been cut to try and get the fees as down as far as they possibly can. They misunderstand the importance of this data, and I think what we need to do is start getting more honest with people. And when sorry, my thoughts are going a little bit in two different directions here. So you can bring them on at any point, so long as you have defined your information requirements clearly. You know what you can practically expect to work with, rather than working on the assumption, ask for everything, and if we don't need it, throw it away, because that inflates the fees. So that's the first thing from a client side that can be done. From the contractor side is actually not wildly inflate your fees just because somebody has said we need this additional information, because what we're finding is that information probably already exists and probably already being delivered. It's how it's being structured when it's delivered that's the difference. And so if we'll start to look at this from a practical and pragmatic perspective, what we'd find is bring them on at schematic design, bring them on at just before delivery. It doesn't matter so long as the scope
In
is
sprints,
defined.
right? Yeah, like little
Yeah.
sprints at each time of like, yeah, just buy a couple days at a time for their input and then let them go again.
One of the things we've stopped doing is when we look at these deliverables and we look at things like the responsibility matrix, who's delivering what and the data that's got to go in, we've actually stopped doing it across the whole project now, and we will just do it stage by stage. Yes, we know what the end deliverable is, but what's the point in asking for 100% of the deliverables schematic stage when actually things are going to change in the next stage anyway? Let's be more reasonable about when we're asking for things, and then it becomes so much more efficient.
I was going to say, just as a note, Nigel, it's not unique to see this connection. It's not just UK that has that problem. It's everywhere else.
No, I appreciate. Yeah.
It's a human problem.
It is a human
Yes.
problem. And I think, I'll go back to the core BIM idea of core BIM is we've been as an industry focusing so much on that technical delivery where you said the nerdy part of BIM and people kind of, it's different than the actual managerial like delivery of the project. It is very much the delivery of the project, and it's increasingly becoming more relevant as people start to ask about things like digital twin and how do we make that possible? It's well, you've got to have that information squared away and you need to know, but it's always been, they see the end product and they go, I want that. But the how to get there is very, very murky for many people, especially owners trying to figure out how to get there. They've got different people within their organizations, different groups within their organizations that have this information would go, yeah, here is exactly what you need. But they never tap them in terms of planning for that project. They never get them at that table. So we talk about the contractors, subcontractors, that's important for the process, certainly. But it's getting the clients familiarized with their own needs and what they want to get at the end of the day. I think it's really, really important. So I'll just say from Core BIM's perspective, that new module that we'll see in version 4 is really aiming at that, trying to help people sort of get their arms around what they want to require and to specify it clearly enough so that people can make these decisions. So it's a lot, it's a lot, but I think we're making some progress.
Oh yeah, that's the other slide I wanted to cover. One of the things that is important about ISO 19650 is it's a generic framework for information delivery. But what has happened and what should happen is that there is a national annex which puts it into context for each country. There aren't that many out there at the moment. There is an Irish national annex. There's a UK national annex. Might even be it, but I know there's a few more in preparation. What this does, it looks at that. This is an excerpt from the UK one. It looks at those deliverables and says, how should that be standardized, even down just to the basics of the formats used, aiming for this open BIM approach rather than people saying you shall deliver in this proprietary format. It says, unless there's a reason not to, it should be delivering, geometrical information as IFC, for example. Non-geometrical as Kobe, that's a whole nother ball game altogether. But the one bit that people don't have problem with is the open documentation format. That seems to be accepted across the board. PDFs or even the XML docs and Excel spreadsheets now. That's given. It's only when we run into this technical side of things, the model delivery and the data delivery, where people haven't done it in this way before, and that's where their stumbling blocks come. It doesn't take long to educate somebody in the fact that this data exists. It has to. It's just the format that you're delivering it in that makes a difference. But it does scare people. It terrifies them. They don't know enough about their own information. I'm not talking about their authoring tools or their modeling tools or anything like that. They don't know enough about their own information to be able to structure it in that way. And that's, if we can get those clear requirements from the clients for their asset information requirements, if we can get that information handed down, that's the starting point for people to start to realize, oh, okay, so this is it's just a specification for my doors. Oh, okay, it's just this. That's what we've got to get to is translating this tech talk into everyday talk.
I was going to say that the IFC piece has been something that I've been a proponent of for a long time. That the standard, model exchanges using IFC, and honestly, it's just a push on the technology side. And I hate to rely on technology, but the technology really has an impact here in making that function. The IFC structure is great, but depending on which tool you're using, the exports may or may not make sense. They may not serve the purpose, and so a lot of that still needs to happen. I think there's been vast improvements over the past couple of years in versions, but still a ways to go to open that up for everyone. And has there anybody actually taken their models and exported to IFC and said, what am I looking at?
I see people shaking their heads up and down. And we have any good stories around that?
Been a long time. Is it still as bad as it was in 2012?
No, it's not that bad. I mean,
Okay.
depending on which tool you're talking about.
Yeah,
I mean,
Revit structural to Tekla steel in 2012 was not great.
You're dating yourself, Nathan.
I know, my gray hair is showing.
What a lesson on IFC that we've actually learned is, and Nathan reminds me of it there actually, it's don't use it as an exchange format. There are typically better formats to use for an exchange format, but as a delivery format, in particularly if you're contracted to deliver Kobe, that's where we would use it for. It becomes an end deliverable to the client rather than a way of exchanging between two separate software systems. If you're going to be exchanging between Tekla and Revit structures, look at the steel formats, look at the concrete formats, CIS2 and all those kind of things. They are going to be better for you.
I was going to say the idea that you're handing it over to a client and that it's not an exchange format at that point is a little bit, I think into the future when we say, don't shoot me here, but when Revit dies, what's next? If we have something that opens the models that we deliver, what is that, right? Is in the IFC better translate into whatever that new piece is. So it's not necessarily a transactional piece for the process immediately, but it will be down the road in the bigger scheme of things. So I do think the improvements again that have been made in the latest versions of IFC are great. And I foresee them continue to be better. I think they're meeting right now, aren't they? BSI is meeting on IFC at the moment this week. There's some work happening now, so all the minds.
We're seeing great improvements every month. Oh, I did have some more. I knew I had some more slides. To sum it up, this is the process of the common data environment that ISO 19650 has. What's important is the bit that's highlighted. Well, in fact, all three of those, and it's about the review. It's about the authorization and acceptance of this information. The information can be anything, and we've gone from trying to standardize the information that's been delivered in the UK to standardizing the process that delivers it, because every project is different, every type of project is different. Even every housing project is different. Whereas you start to look at the different construction projects, we are doing at the moment, we're doing a museum extension, and we're also doing a 26-mile replacement of all the sewers across London. The scope is so different, you can't standardize the data. What you have to look at is actually ISO 19650 delivers a way of producing information, reviewing it and accepting it, rather than standardizing the data itself. The structures behind it is what's about.
That's an important point in the process, right? Because the AEC is so diverse. Just take each of the individual stakeholders. There's just a ton of diversity in what everybody does, the different disciplines within trying to standardize on a particular data structure, nearly impossible, right? So an important point you bring up there. The terminology here is really important to kind of help folks understand that process that you're talking about. So review and approval versus authorization. What's the nuance there that that's going on that makes a difference, and why it has to be there for this process to work?
That's exactly what ISO 19650 describes. And the difference is who the information is going for and what it's being used for. So, you know, talking about common standard problems on any project, you receive information as a designer from one of the others. Let's say you're the architect receiving it from the engineer. That information is out of date with the latest information you've got. It's not in the same coordinate space. All those kind of basics that we're not even starting to talk about data structures yet. We're talking about the basics of coordinating information. That the review and approval is important for work that's been generated inside of a discipline to be shared with other disciplines. And that's one of the things that UK National Annex does. It starts to give these standardized codes for what the information can be used or not. So if you receive it, you're receiving it for coordination. You know that information has been approved and it should be in the same coordinate space. Whereas if you're getting it for S3, it may not be. It's actually just for review and checking up, you know, a draft document, for example. But that approval is approval for sharing it with the rest of the design team. The authorization is then when we get to delivery with the client, the lead appointed party, typically the general contractor or whoever is in charge of this data, they are saying this information is good enough to go to the client. It's ready to go. Now that might be, you know, each individual discipline having that and issuing directly to the client. It depends on the contractual structure. But authorization is good enough to go to the clients. And then the acceptance, the one that this all leads to, is whether or not at the end of a project, the client is going to accept it, or they come back with changes, or they come back with requirements that you haven't met. I kind of question for everybody in on this conversation is, you know, I'm sure you're battling with every project that you are receiving non-acceptances from your clients saying this doesn't meet the brief, this doesn't meet the scope. How many of those clients haven't been clear enough in what that scope is for receiving the information? How many projects can you go to where you have a list of acceptance criteria or key performance indicators or whatever it is that says we will accept the data, the information on these grounds? I have never seen it on a project. There's a lot of vagaries in the contract that say you have to deliver this. And yes, of course, there will be materials requirements, performance requirements. But in terms of the information, that's where it starts to fall apart. You know, we need to have the information grouped into rooms. We need to have the information on a specific floor. We need to have the data in this structure to be able to accept it. I've never seen it on a project yet. How about everybody else? I've done enough talking.
So just put a question in the chat, but it seems like a lot of this is always put back on the owner, maybe sometimes put on the architectural team, but in my experience, you know, the owner is the least savvy of the bunch, especially when it comes to like data that needs to be shared for the actual execution of like a architectural to construction handoff. And it seems like, but that's where the ultimate requirements are coming from. And it seems like this is like the great use of technology to where we could maybe solve some of this or make this easier for the owner. But not sure necessarily how we do that without conversations like this.
I mean, just from this conversation, like I think the idea of a short sprint that where like you hire the downstream contractors and who you need at that review and approval and red circle up there at the top, because you normally wouldn't have them till maybe the authorization or even further down, but you don't need them the whole time, but you need them for certain things, right? It's like really scoping it out appropriately. I think Nigel was my big takeaway of what is the appropriate scope for, and Kelly, Luby, I'll throw this to you. Like how much time should a trade contractor spend way up front so that, you know, some of the ways you do your work can be beneficial, but also like you don't need to be there for like super nitpicky constructability things because it's way too early for that, right?
No, I think this is a really interesting diagram. And yeah, we want to be involved a little bit early to make sure we understand not scope, but scale of what we're doing and some of the basics that are involved and outlines and things like that. But I think what's a lot more interesting about this is, Nigel, you haven't dived down into this too much, but the idea that the archive documents that are going to be given, or the archive information that's going to be given, the asset data, the as-built drawings and models, and this type of information is going to be coming from the design team, fascinates me. Because frankly, you guys don't have half of that information. Even if you do, it's probably wrong by the time we're done with it.
Does this say this comes from the design team?
This would come from everybody. So this is, it's the delivery team is the way we term it. It's the design team, it's the construction team, it's everybody. So this applies to everyone.
Well, and so then I think that's one of these things that really needs to be torn down is, you know, when we started talking about, so we started talking about the original concept, when we started going through this, you're talking about what the architect is delivering and what the design team is delivering. And now that we've gotten into this, how is the data getting from the design team to the contractors to be finalized? Because right now what I've seen is it's not. The design team has their set of data over here. The trade contractors have their set of data over here, and it all gets sent in separately. And it is not coordinated by anyone. It's not sent through, and it's not, and I know you said not standardized, but through a structure. I'm sorry, it should be standardized. Why the hell wouldn't you want it standardized? If I'm an owner and people send me information that isn't standardized, that is useless to me. That's bad data.
But as an owner, you need to specify that, right? They need to specify that. And I
Absolutely.
think that's the point. I think I agree, Nigel, is that, and Travis, you're like, a lot of it goes back to the owner, but it absolutely does go back to the owner because they need to be specific about what they want, because it drives the process that we all sort of sign on to or find ourselves in the midst of, whether we want to be or not.
But that's
that
my
we're trying to
question.
deliver.
Yeah.
But that's why we're having this discussion. We're talking about what the ISO 19650 starts with and how we can use it. And one of the biggest places where ISO 19650 falls down, where owners fall down and where we can make an improvement, is figuring out internally between the design and trades that work on these projects is how we can pass data back and forth to give something standardized to the client and to work together.
Well, and I would argue it's the last step of it, right? And I think it's 2 slides ahead, Kelly, right? Where we actually have those different, the fields within the file naming convention. Cause it's like, that's like the lowest common denominator
Right.
of those different categories. And just having that conversation there of, I mean, we could spend a whole nother hour just on what we mean by location, right? Nigel,
Yep.
But like, yeah, I think that's the question, and some of the questions that yeah, we're going to pose in here for this group. So I'm glad you led us to it, Kelly. Is yeah, like how hard would it be? And maybe it is worthwhile, Nigel, just to really quickly, you know, give a high level of, you know, how these terms, and I would call this a work breakdown structure of a sorts. It's like a naming convention breakdown structure or whatever, but you know, a little bit of like how all those drop down choices get developed in the first place. And then we can talk about, you know, if they work and how they'd work downstream for the recipients of it.
Yeah, so this is the one thing that is very common in the UK now, is this convention just for the naming of the information that's being put together. Doesn't matter what type of information it is. You've got a drawing example there, but I don't work on a job now where this doesn't happen. So this is something that has been fundamentally helps with identification and consistency of the information. Standardization should absolutely happen, just to kind of back your point up there, Kelly. Some of it is fairly easy and straightforward. You know, the project, yes, that's a single code that people can identify. The originator, yes, you know, EVO for evolve, or, you know, HDR for HDR, those kind of things. Where it comes down into a bit more of a debate, and the bits you've got in blue are actually, you know, the bits that still cause problems. How do you break this down? We've got volume and system location. It's actually changed in the latest version of the UK National Annex to being, oh, I see, my mind's gone completely blank now, but they've changed from volume and system to and location to function and spatial. But for exactly this reason of discussion, in the fact that that leads people into deciding, oh, it should be volume. So that's the building code. Well, hold on, isn't that the location, or is that the floor? The way it transformed in only just this year, it's released the second version of the UK National Annex, function and spatial, so that it is down more to the project or the end client, or the general contractor who has to actually build and deliver this, of how this information needs to be broken down. And let's not forget, there are 2 different reasons for delivering data. Are we delivering it for construction, or are we delivering for asset information? 2 very different deliverables, and why we have the 2 different data drops in the UK. In terms of, you know, construction, it's highly likely that that third field there would be a not drawing package, a package of information. Is it the facade? Is it steelwork? Is it foundations? What is it that allows that information to be costed, found, and constructed? Spatial will change depending on the type of project it is. And again, you've got to take this in conjunction again with how are your projects actually being financed? What do you use that project code? How is that done? The new version has made it far more flexible to say, here are the fields, use them for what you need on a project. Volume and system location doesn't really work for an infrastructure project, for a linear asset. But function and spatial is a lot easier to use in that instance. And that's what we're finding again is it's a lot of this it's been building focused, it's been BIM focused. We need to get out of that environment and start looking at, hold on, construction and deliverables rather than forcing this into types. What we're finding in the UK is nobody understands it. Everybody does their own thing within those fields, which is fine. ISO 19650 allows for that because it comes down to what is the requirement on that project. What we're looking at now in the UK is a series of guides. We've written a load, there are more coming, that tell people how to implement this on a specific type of project. And that's what we're seeing the development over the next couple of years we're going to see in the UK. So over to you guys.
So
Darren was patiently raising his hand, and then I saw I pulled it down. Do you have a comment?
Oh, I've got many, which, part of the problem is, just even look at it a mechanic, if you had somebody define system at the third square on the design side in a silo versus the construction team, you're going to have different systems. Something like a fuel oil system on the design side, that's one system. On the construction side, that's 4 systems. There's a supply, there's a return, there's a fill, there's a vent. And so we break these things down for various reasons, just in the performance of what we're doing. Now, that's probably not more granular than what an owner would want. They're probably going to want more on the design side, but there's going to be cases where
but it's an important process, Darren.
You have these things that don't necessarily line up, and at some point you need to line them up. Where it gets complicated is sometimes these breakdowns cross boundaries. And I see this, probably the best example I can give is an estimating bid form. We break our system, we break our bids up by system, floor, area, zone, and then somebody says, well, I want exhaust grills on a broke out separately. Well, those span multiple systems. So do I pull them out of there? What do I do with supply? Where do those go? And now I can't look at what a system actually costs me to install or labor, because I've arbitrarily pulled out things that somebody thought they needed. So and what I see from owners is they don't know either. So they hire a consultant who just says, give me everything. And there's a cost to that. So it seems like, at some point we need to get really granular with the data, and everyone's kind of hesitant to do that. Even like a mechanical system, what value do you want? Do you want the design value or the actual balanced value? Well, honestly, I think the owner would want both, but I've yet to see a software system manage that, handle that. They just, here's the value of a system, the CFM. And it's like, well, there's a design value, but when I balance it, it's something different. And the owner is probably going to really want both of those. So in those cases, there's not a single source. They come together and run in parallel.
Well, Darren, that's the larger normalization that I go to GAP, generally applied accounting practices, is like kind of the best example of like, yes, there's always going to be those what if scenarios, and that whoever those powers that be, and as Travis said, like whether that's CPC gathering representatives like yourself that are trusted in the industry to say, here's what we think it should be, or there's already somebody out there that's published it. I think that we do need to get to that level of normalization, consistency, whatever. And this is where, I think I get as not sexy as it is, that this, naming convention thing here is a really important step in how does this become the highest level category framework that ties to cost, that ties to schedule, that ties to procurement and other things. Because at the end of the day, yes, Darren, you can segment things down, but the higher level categories do actually work within these, 7 systems. And there's one thing I know, so, they spent a lot of time on this and they've thought about it way more than we have.
And really, I think though, in this situation here, the 19650 is kind of looking at this as a deliverable, as it's way in the background, the deliverable from a project to an owner. So if you're delivering a drawing, if you're delivering an Excel file, if you're delivering a DWG, this is the set naming convention or the attributes within the model that they're looking for or anything. This is literally, hey, I'm going to submit my, drawing A101 to you, and part of the package is this. So it's tough because then the naming convention is going down for actual elements within a Revit model or what you're delivering on the asset side, or even O&Ms and warranties coming with it, is that could be completely different at some point.
So a variation on this, because I think we're mixing a bunch of different things together here, which is the norm for our industry, right? It's all spaghetti. We need to prepare the owner so they know what they're doing, or give them the tool to know what they're asking for and what they're managing. And then we need to work within the constraints of a flexible system in the naming convention. It just says these are some of the codes you can use, but use them any way you want to. Well, we have to have a time and a place to come to consensus that the naming convention for this particular project is something, right? These codes mean something. That go slow to go fast. And then when you start talking about these different attributes, the naming convention gives you a way to classify a particular file, but then there's different variables for each file that you can capture in the form of metadata, which is not required for the naming convention. The naming convention classifies things, but the metadata would give you a way to then shape the same information in a different view. So Nigel, is there any application of that? Rachel, do you have any perspective on that, where metadata is your clarifying? It doesn't, mess up the naming convention, if you will.
To come to Darren's point there of how you split the systems down, that's exactly what the metadata allows you to do. In terms of this, you have to look at the deliverable naming convention as kind of the first step to identifying what information you need. It's the top level, isn't it? I'm going onto my, I'm going on a Procore, I'm going on to whatever and searching through things. How do I find the right data? But when you get into it, Darren's point is, how do you then use that data correctly? And for us, simple classification on any element that you're delivering, whether that's a drawing or whether it's a model or a specification, to be able to identify that, how that, take a uniformat or omniformat or uniclass, in terms of a system. If you're using that to classify your data inside of the information container, that's when that data becomes far more usable. You found the right data, but then how do you use it is the next question down. And if you're classifying it in a way, it always comes back to, Travis's point there on the chat, we need to work as tech partners so it becomes automatic for owners. Yes, we need to ask them those questions. Is I can do it this way, or I cannot do it this way, or I can do it a totally different way. What's best for you, either at construction or handover for final delivery? How would this break down? That's what we're seeing. The differences happen in projects now is that people are starting to think about that, and they're asking, well, there are classification systems in place. As a minimum, put that on all of your objects. And when we come to looking at those systems later, is it a supply system? Is it a specific bit of equipment within that system? That can then be done. It keeps that flexible without too much overhead on the preparation of the deliveries.
The progressive development of a standard is actually the way to go, because right now, if we jumped into something and said prescriptive all the way down to the tiniest detail, we'd be off. We'd be so wrong so quickly. So thinking about from a standardization standpoint, I mean, it's you give a little, you have to, the compromise is what people do not want to make. Oftentimes when you get into this, let's create a standard. Well, when you create a standard, you may not get everything you want or everything you thought should be there for whatever purpose you had. So that is the challenge, especially with looking at things like this applying to the US marketplace. Talk about, vertical versus horizontal work is a big division first off, but then there's so many different marketplaces that have different needs and different requirements for these bits of data. And so it becomes infinitely more difficult to try and get everyone on the same page. But we're making that stand with the US, trying to get some standardization, because we all know there's a value there. So I think people will be more willing to, I hope, make some concessions, but have a real tech partners sort of coming in and saying, let's get our best effort together to make sure we get a good solid starting point to standardize
Yeah.
around these things.
I would agree that peeling an onion is the way to go. I guess, my challenge is we can't even agree on this internally within our own organization. We've got two pizzas, estimating and construction. One's cut up in triangles, one's in squares, and somebody doesn't like crust, and somebody else just took a bite out of one and left it. And okay, how much pepperoni per slice do we have? It's like impossible, and it's like, well, pull out every third pepperoni on one of them. And so it's a challenge just even internally to try to find, we end up getting such a high level, and get you numbers comparison at a building level. And then, okay, well, that's way too big. We got to go down, and it's a challenge. For sure.
You got to think like an economist, right? Like economists are kind of, they're wired differently, because you have to almost do that. All right, how do I level out to an apples to apples comparison? And the more that we can come up with standard translations that get ourselves to apples and understand the nuance of where things need to translate. Like anytime I've seen actual projects in the Middle East do earned value reporting, like it was a cluster for some of these calculations for them to get to something that actually made half sense. But it was all just like, oh, well, 60% of the concrete work by cubic foot is equal to the form work. Because you're just kind of putting your thumb up and guesstimating. And at a certain point you have to, right? But at least you're clarifying and putting out what those assumptions are. And who is that entity that can hold on to those assumptions, like RICS or other groups that are out there that are trying to standardize this stuff, so that again we're not recreating the wheel.
Well, and I think that's the key is, when we talk about standards doesn't mean that we have everything locked down perfectly. It means that we've created a foundation that has a basic framework.
Right. It's a minimum amount of information we can agree on.
Yeah. And the other thing is too, is that you talk about when did the trade contractors get invited in? Well, they got to be part of that first conversation up front, because, like looking at this right here, I can tell I have clients that we work for that would be the kind to adopt ISO 19650, and the location, 3 digits for the location is not enough for the way they break their information down. I mean, you take any standard and you can break it into pieces and, make it worthless, but you can still create a framework that's high enough to give people a starting point. And then, if it's on a project level or like a client portfolio level, you can say, you know what, we're also going to add in this value or this character or these particular choices for abbreviations. And that's the thing that we're missing as a whole is right now, to be able to get to the world that we all talk about being in, but we all acknowledge that we're not in, transferring data back and forth, there has to be normalization of data somewhere. And so the conversation has to happen. There has to be a high level standardization, and then there has to be additional conversations that happen at company and project levels.
Could Nigel, I was wondering if you could kind of clarify for me how this is actually transpires in the UK. Is this government work, or is actually private sector work done? Because I see, that was one of the problems with the national BIM standard. It's highly driven by, academia, Army Corps of Engineer, large capital facility owners. And most contractors, the bulk of their portfolio of work that they do is probably in the private sector, where we've got a developer doing a shell and core. They're going to take their money and run. They don't care. They're demobilizing the train, even though the TI, and the tenant could use it on their tenant improvement, and they don't care about any of this stuff. So I think some of the key is making this, and it's to me, at least in the US, simple enough that it makes sense to implement it on every project. Because when I get that one job from the University of Washington, okay, what do? This isn't anything I care about. And then to talk about it before that job happens, it's like, well, we don't do that type of work that often, so why would we waste our time? We've got to kind of somehow bubble this up into a simple, kind of almost automatic, where it's very low effort, so that when it does come up, it just happens and it's not an intentional work effort.
It has to be a low bar to entry too, because a lot of things, what happens now is we start talking about standards that a private organization has developed and that get released out there, and people hear these terms and they just start using them. LOD is the fucking bane of my existence.
Which one are you talking about? There's at least 2 of them.
But if I have one more client that mandates LOD 500 on my install drawings, I'm fascinated by this. And even when they ask for LOD 400, that's not what they want. They just know that gets me everything, and I want everything, so I'm going to ask for that. And we have general contractors that are like, well, nope, they put it in the BIM execution plan, so you're doing it, period. And others will be like, okay, we understand, we'll talk to the client, we'll see what they want, things like that. And that's the type of stuff that we need to eliminate, is those levels of those types of conversations where, okay, I get that we made it easy, but we also made easy so complicated that it forces all this additional work, right? So we need to stick to the data and some basic naming conventions so that we're not getting into that type of thing where suddenly we're forcing work on people that doesn't need to be done. People are asking for things they don't know what they're asking for. I mean, that's why Kobe never took off over here other than a few very, very select markets, right? I don't even know anybody that uses the term Kobe, but they're still asking for it only really in higher education workspaces, maybe. And the occasional government project, but they don't call it Kobe. Dear God, don't call it Kobe. Everybody cringes when you say that word.
That's
Kelly.
It's an interesting one from our side, because people are more asking for Kobe more and more often. And that's been a big change in standardization of data. I think that the key, you guys have summed this up from our perspective. This is a framework for standardization. It's not a standard in and of itself. It's a framework for the way information is generated, reviewed, and delivered, not a standard of what is delivered. When we can get that across, we never talk about it as a standard anymore. We talk about it as a framework, and people start to see a little bit difference. Oh, hold on. So I could ask for more than 3 characters in that field. That's something that's, again, it's happened this year, Kelly, is, that restriction was shouted down so many times in the UK. It was just taken out. It doesn't need to be 3 digits, or 2 digits. It was actually 2. What it needs to be is, what does the project need? Make it consistent and standardized for that project, not for every project, because this project doesn't have the same requirements as the next one. So we're getting there. We're seeing it different. Kobe has been a bit of a game changer for the way that this has been approached over here in the UK. And call it Kobe, call it standard structure for asset delivery, whatever you want to call it. What it's allowed clients to do who are looking at it from this angle is say, it's given us a standard to ask for from the design team and from our asset management teams for an information exchange format that we can just say, deliver this, make it work, and we've got interoperability between our delivery and our systems. It doesn't have to go redesigning the wheel because this uses a slightly different database, or this one uses CSV files, or one of our clients themselves have said our strategy will now be based on it, both internally and externally, because we know it's structured. We can ask for it. We won't use it all, and we don't need it all. So they'll say it needs to be structured in this way, but we only need this sheet. We only need this sheet. We actually don't need, assembly, because it doesn't mean anything to us.
I have a question just in general. That normalization is what you're saying. I mean, it provides a form of normalization so that people can start to work together, right? But any of this is different from what we're used to, what people are used to. So that is a challenge. We say that we want it to be an easy button for people. I think the thing that we've been running into all along is that the thought ahead of time, we started the conversation with this, is that the owner needs to specify what they want. People need to understand and plan for when they have these sprints and when they bring people in and more effectively run the projects. That takes time to coordinate those things. So it's one of those challenges that I'm really interested to hear perspective on, because Darren and Kelly, both of you talked about it. It's like, this is just frustrating. Make it easier. Make it easier. Don't make it something more complicated. But I think when we talk about the thinking that has to happen, that becomes more complicated to most people than they want.
It does. I think that's where LOD, it became so easy, it made more work, because, well, I'm just going to ask for the ultimate, supersize it. And that created a lot of work that didn't have value. So I think the ISO seems to be skinning the onion a little bit differently, which I think maybe is heading in the right direction. But people, LOD's been an excuse for people to not to have to talk about the detail that they needed to talk about. I mean, internally, just in our own supply chain logistics discussion, you know how hard it is to get a group of people to discuss and agree on what the difference between a status, a location, and a process is. That's pretty small potatoes, and that's a hard discussion just in itself. So like I said, I think a lot of people gravitate to an LOD because, well, I don't have to talk about anything. I'll just throw a number at it and it's somebody else's problem. So at some point, we do have to get into a little bit of detail.
Yeah.
So
and
Rachel, I think this ties into what you have on this last slide that you projected. It is complicated. Folks are asking for the simplistic. But what does this tell us? How do we get from where we are to whatever? At least we're achieving consensus here of what we're looking for. Making the complex more simple. So can you speak to the slide here? And we have about 6 minutes left.
Yeah, and I think the that adoption, that curve of like what happens is, we mentioned earlier, is that a lot of the standardization is trying to push in the public policy, the government work and things like that. Saw that in UK as far as a mandate, and then the US BIM standard, focusing on those things. Those things we're trying to push those because they're the ones that are slowest to change and kind of big giant behemoths. Everybody else sort of is catching up to where the technology is, and that's that struggle, I think. And just more of an observation here is the struggle that we see is 9 different standards that we can't agree on in our own companies, the larger companies that are trying to, like, oh, here's a standard for this, here's a standard for this, and that struggle that we see in those companies, and then try to offer that up to the industry and say, here's something you can do. It doesn't work that way. It's trying to figure out the other ways to say, let's start at that common denominator, and maybe it's not as technical as you're going to get in the high-tech enabled firms and high-tech enabled owners and whatnot, but we get a common denominator across the board and try to close that gap a little bit more effectively that way. And I think ISO 19650, saying peeling the onion a little bit differently, is in the observations that we were seeing as we build the core BIM standard, it's not, I mean, that's why you have annexes, right? So we're looking at a US annex as well. But just taking cues from ISO 19650 it's not specific enough in some cases, and in some cases it's more specific than we would accept. And so trying to pare that down to what makes the most sense, I think is the challenge that we have underway. And I will encourage you guys, I have to put a plug in representing the BIM Council, is that we are looking at work groups to identify product data more consistently. So there's a team looking at that's kind of formulating at the moment, working with BSI and NIBS as partners on those things. Again, you mentioned Kobe, whether that makes you cringe or want to throw something out the window. Either way, I think the standardization is important, and having a voice in that conversation. I encourage anybody who has something to say about that to join us and help move that forward. There's been some dramatic changes in that as well, which you'll see in both what BSI is doing, what NIBS is doing. So Kobe's version 4 will look quite a bit different than version 3, moving towards sort of responses to comments from the industry, as well as what BSI is shaping up to do as well on an international stage. So I think we're being ushered out. I don't know. Where did Nathan go?
We have about 3 minutes till they pull us back in. So does anybody have any parting questions or thoughts that they'd like to share with the group?
I do want to say, if we're all sitting here asking for standards to come through, somebody to be standardized and do it. The problem is that there's a lot of bitch and moaning coming across from the consultants that when that happens. So Kobe's a standard. Kobe's being required by so many owners. Do you know how many AEC firms understand Kobe? It's minimal, very, very, very little. And they just bitch and moan. I don't want to give Kobe. They just deliver bad information. Once again, there's a standard. LOD is a standard. It is set up. It doesn't matter if they're asking for LOD 500, make them pay for it. That's part of it. If they're going to ask for it, then they got to pay for it too. I've seen that 100 times over, but we have been given the standards. We have been put this together. I mean, really with ISO 19650, I would say every AEC firm needs to go find a document control person, because controlling all those files and understanding exactly how they go through is huge. So that's just my 2 cents.
Is that where you saw transformation over in the UK, Nigel?
Yes. In a simple phrase, yes. I can see there's a little countdown going on there, so I don't want to talk too long. But summarize it. It's if it's being asked for, either pay it or tell them what you're going to deliver instead. People don't, they put LOD 400, 500 down because they don't understand what they're actually wanting to get. You as a delivery team know what you're delivering. Tell them instead. That's when it makes a difference, when you can actually start to understand what it is. Kobe's not difficult. If you deliver an IFC, most of the work is done for you as long as you've got the data in there and it's structured correctly. Most people care about the structure. The data will vary on projects, but education and working together as a team has made the big difference. Working together to deliver the project rather than working against each other. That's where we see the real benefits.
Rachel, in the last 50 seconds, any parting thoughts?
Again, if you guys are interested and passionate, which it sounds like you are, I welcome you to join us in conversations with the BIM Council on as they're looking at possibility of additions of standards to that BIM standard that speak more to what you believe to be needed. So we need voices on those committees and those work groups.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate everybody's participation today. We had a lively group as usual. Took as many notes as I could for the roundup here in a few seconds. Yeah, everybody on the phone here had something to contribute, and we appreciate that. If you have follow-up questions, send them our way at CPC. We can always get them out to the folks here on the call, and look forward to discussing this topic more. Thanks for participating today. Appreciate it, everybody.